Welcome to Ask Ralph and Lahni, and this episode is one of our special annual episodes because we look at the year ahead through a technique that we've started to do quite many years ago called forecast based on the Chinese New Year. And you know the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times, and this is going to be a very interesting year because the New Year, the Chinese New Year, is defined by the new moon in Aquarius, yes, which means the sun and the moon are conjunct next to each other in the same sign. So the moon in Aquarius at the same degree that the sun is in Aquarius. Well, strangely enough, and I don't even know when this has happened before, we have two new moons in Aquarius. Now there's 30 degrees in a sign. 0 degrees is when the first new moon takes place. 29 and 59 seconds, just about to jump over into the next sign, is when the second one takes place. So how do we even decide which one to use as a stepping off point? We know how the country decided by the time they made the calendars, but we're going to look at it astrologically for you.
Right, and we think to a certain extent in China they decided to do it to the later one because preparing for the Chinese New Year is a big event. In China and many Asian countries, it is the only holiday in the year, and it's an 8-day long holiday. So they need time to prepare all those dragon costumes and decorations, and it's nicer if you can do it in slightly warmer weather, which 30 days does give you a bit of an advantage.
Well, and it's interesting because, of course, in this case, we've got the parameters for the Chinese New Year clearly laid out. The first new moon in Aquarius takes place at January 20th. So January 20th in any given year is just about the earliest that the Chinese New Year can take place. And the second new moon in Aquarius is on February 18th. So that's about the latest point at which you could have the new moon in Aquarius, because then the sun moves into the next sign. So it's very interesting looking at these charts this year because we get to look at two charts and kind of validate one or the other, or maybe both.
Right. And the thing about the Chinese New Year is what it symbolizes is when all the energy of the Earth, the electromagnetic fields, tend to pull the most inwards towards the center of the Earth, and it grounds you. So it's really a seed point. It's in the life cycle. It's when the seed, all the energy is condensed into the seed. So what it does is it gives you a sign of where the year is going to grow. Right. After the Chinese New Year, the seeds begin to germinate. The greatest number of seeds begin to germinate. So to start off with, we're starting off with looking at the charts for what we consider the center of the world, Napa. California, because that's where we live, wine country.
Center of our world.
Yes, exactly. And the two charts for that are very interesting. And traditionally, there is the concept of the years with the two moons or the year with no moons, or the blue moon. And so we're going to go with the later one because that's what everyone seems to have selected for.
And that's when it's going to be celebrated. So there's a lot to be said for the energy of intention that's going to be pushed into that second new moon in Aquarius, because that's when China and globally it's going to be celebrated.
Right. And the other two charts we're going to look at carefully are going to be Washington, D.C., for obvious reasons, and London. And London we're picking because Jupiter, the biggest planet, the guy in the plaid suit, is directly overhead London, actually over that part of the world at the time. And that usually shows a certain amount of prominence in the course of the year.
Well, and of course, we love Jupiter in the United States, but we don't love Jupiter like China loves Jupiter.
Yes.
In fact, their whole Chinese astrology is based on the position of Jupiter. That's where the animal years come from. And that's a whole other show. But enough said about that. Jupiter is very prominent when we're looking at anything that has to do with the Chinese New Year. So we always like to look globally on our astrocartography charts. Where is the line that Jupiter is going to demarcate along its path on the Earth?
And this year, and this is true no matter pretty much where you are on the planet, it's actually a very good year for just people. And I mean for like personal relationships. And the reason is that this year, both Mercury which relates to our communication, those people who are close around us, our relationship with our children and our siblings, and Venus, which relates to how we interact with people on a social level in terms of those things that we enjoy, that those things we take pleasure in, are both very well placed, very comfortably placed. In fact, Venus is actually conjunct Mars, which means that it has the potential to be a very romantic year because Venus is in Pisces, a very romantic sign. So this is a year in which you should really work on your relationships, work on your communication skills. Maybe it's a good year to expand, if not your computer language skills, then maybe your international language skills and learn another language, something I'm always a big fan of.
You don't need an excuse to expand your
No,
language skills.
no.
He's currently studying German, so he adds that to his coterie of
Yes,
languages.
I do like languages. Math
Yes.
skills, not so much. Language skills. So this is a very good year for both these areas, but also with the Mercury in Aquarius, it's going to be, once again, we're going to see the web continue to grow in significance worldwide. And with Venus and Pisces, we're going to see also a growth, I think, more and more energy going to compassionate purposes. We've been seeing this on the web now where people will raise money for organizations, for individuals. I think we're going to continue to see this grow. And in fact, as we do these charts, I have to tell you that if you in your life simply studied geopolitics and you kept very up on what was going on in the news and in terms of a global scale, maybe you watch Fareed Zakaria's GPS on Sunday mornings, which talks about international affairs, and maybe when you go to the bookstore, page through, Foreign Affairs magazine
Or BBC World News.
and really kept up on this stuff, you would actually recognize many of the things that we're talking about, because it's not like astrology exists independent of the world. What it's doing is giving you a picture of the world. What's really fun for us, and it's really part of the significance of astrology, is that it highlights when is something just a flash in the pan, and when is it an ongoing trend
Right.
that's going to have real staying power through the course of the year. And that's really what the Chinese chart is about. It's showing us where are these themes going to play out during a good part of the year. So one of the things that we're seeing on the West Coast is we have Jupiter rising. It's trining the Uranus in the 9th house. So I think we're going to see a lot of money coming here from overseas.
We often do,
Yeah.
but even so, I think that that's going to increase and
Yeah.
continue to trend.
Yeah, and we've already been seeing that. I mean, a lot of properties being bought by people from Asia, from people from Europe, Russia, and this is something that's happening actually in a lot of the big international capitals. But I think we're going to see an increase of that, especially in California. One of the things that's going along California, and that's that Uranus up by the midheaven, it's off the coast there, that we've been having a number of tremors, quakes. And I think that we're going to continue to
certainly
see that
have.
up along the coast this year. I don't think it's going to be as extreme as we've seen, simply because it's Uranus and Aries. I think it's going to be more short term. But who is going to see a lot of is going to be out by Hawaii. Hawaii is going to see a lot. When you look at the astrocartography for Hawaii, you have a bunch of big players. You have the Sun, the Moon, Neptune, Chiron, Pallas, Mars, and who's that hiding behind there? And Venus. Where you put that much weight over a particular part of the planet during a seed time, it puts a lot of pressure. Now, if you've been following the news, of course, villages have been disappearing because Pele has been saying, hey, I need a little more space. I need a new dress.
Well, and what Ralph is referring to is that at the moment of the Chinese New Year, where are the planets directly overhead? I have that little app for my Android phone, that Google Sky
Right.
Map, and it's really fun to launch that and just hold it up against the sky and say, oh, there's where Mercury is right now. There's where the Sun is right now. There's where Saturn is right now. And so this, at the time of the Chinese New Year, those planets that he just mentioned are directly overhead in Hawaii. So that means a lot of energy concentrated in one space, a lot of signals, because think about these planets as as transmitters. You know, we have no trouble thinking about cell phone towers and satellites transmitting information and energy to us. How about the planets, which are much bigger and much stronger, transmitting energy to our landmass, but also to and amongst each other. So that's a lot of concentration of activity going on over this small landmass.
I think something that's real significant with the California charts or the West Coast charts is, you know, you have that sun and moon in the 7th house. It's the area of partnerships. And, you know, the number of international partnerships that goes on the West Coast is pretty amazing. Something that's interesting is that the sun and the moon are at the last minutes of the sign. And we find that when you have a lot of new moons or full moons happening at the end of a sign, it's a transitional point. There's going to be, all during this year, there's going to be a certain sense of anticipation. It's one of those anticipation years. We've had a number of those recently. I think we're going to, and when it translates, it's going to translate into the 8th house of power. I think we're going to see...
And hidden power, because it's in Pisces.
Yeah, and I think...
the 8th house on the West Coast.
And I think one of the things we're going to see is that within these international partnerships, the companies from the West Coast are going to be a little bit more willing to take power in these situations. Like, for instance, the situation that just happened with Sony, where it's the biggest hack in American history.
Right.
Well, you know, Sony, in case anyone forgot this, started off with what? Transistor radios. They are a technology company. Right.
And they're a Japanese company.
And a Japanese company.
We've got this whole concept of foreign investment here, foreign investors partnering with our technology, all things that have to do with Uranus that we mentioned, with Aquarius that we mentioned, with Jupiter, the planet of expansion and long distance travel. So all of these things are converging into, you know, making the world flat.
Right.
And us having to be more and more aware of what's going on in the world because it affects us directly at home, because there's not a line of demarcation between us and the rest of the world.
Right. And one of the things that's taking place is the fact that, globally speaking, in terms of the demographics, a lot of the biggest countries in the world are aging. The United States, interestingly enough, is actually relatively young, in part because we handle immigrants much better than anybody else does. It's our birthright. But additionally, when a lot of the other countries after the Second World War urbanized, the United States suburbanized. So we tended to move into bigger houses. Well, it's a lot easier to have children, or even more than one child, or even more than 2 children, if you live in a house than if you live in a little 1-bedroom apartment in a city.
There's places in China that have 300 square foot apartments.
Right.
300 square feet. Right. I can't even wrap my head around that.
We've had feng shui.
No children are happening there.
Yeah, we've had feng shui clients who had closets bigger than that.
Yeah.
Nice closets. So,
Man.
Yes. So what's going to happen is, I think that's one of the shifts that we're going to take place, is you have a younger community of business people who, when they're in these international situations and they're all studying Rosetta Stone and they're all learning languages, and are going to say in these international partnerships, being a little bit more aggressive in terms of the input that they have. And when you look at what's going on over China at the same time, and like I said, and I think we're going to see some really great advances on the West Coast in terms of technology, and that's that Mercury, Vesta, Uranus, combination on the West Coast. We're going to see some really great inventions come out of the West Coast, as if that was like not a given.
Well, that's not a new concept for the West Coast, but I think what's going to happen is that a lot of technologies that were kind of held back, unpopular, underfunded, and things like that. I think the climate has changed now, and that is a pun, in such a way that these efforts on protecting us from climate change and all these, clean fuel technologies and all that kind of technology has now sort of turned a corner in terms of people wanting to invest in those more and making the changes to retrofit whatever they need to retrofit to come up online with that. So I think especially in that area of technology, there's going to be a sudden sort of burst of emphasis on that.
Yeah, and I think the Mercury component of it, because remember it's Mercury in Aquarius. Once again, a lot of young people coming into this. We're seeing, California is so young, it's really quite amazing. Even where we live in wine country, it's a lot of young people working in the wineries.
I do so think, though, that it will also be a number of people returning to technology fields that are older people, because between the first new moon in Aquarius and the second new moon in Aquarius, it doesn't usually go backwards. So it's been retrograde in between, which is interesting because it's direct now in both of these charts. So for a 3-week period in between this month of the 2 new moons, Mercury has gone retrograde. So Mercury in the field of technology, and communications and everything. I think we're going to see, people who have left those fields come back into those fields, or, us to go back to earlier versions of technology and sort of move them forward.
Well, also, because we have a very large baby boom, the baby boom proportionally was the largest demographic in the world, and even though we've had attrition, of course, one thing that does happen with that is you have very highly skilled people who, thanks to technology, can keep working. Years ago, if it was your work was so dependent upon physical activity, as people would get older, their ability to physically do the work was harder. And also, in the Chinese charts, up through China, you're running in Saturn and Sagittarius. I think that with what it's showing, and this is something that China's doing, is they're taking on really big projects, big infrastructure. Saturn's all about structures. It's about walls and buildings and big ships. And they're doing a lot of massive projects, big pipelines. They're actually, apparently it looks like Chinese money behind putting another canal through the Isthmus of Panama, but actually in Guatemala. Well,
that's
really?
A huge project, yeah.
And it's actually a canal that would be big enough for the biggest tankers that cannot go through the Panama Canal. This is the kind of things that they're starting to bet on. And it's partly because
Jupiter,
but it's the Saturn in Sagittarius. Sagittarius looks towards the future.
It's true.
It's always, what am I going to build towards the future?
And of course, Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, so we've got that whole connection.
And I think that because of that, they're kind of less inclined to want to worry about the Mercury stuff. I'm not going to worry about phones. I'm not going to worry about handheld devices. I'm not going to worry about stuff that you can text to your friends. I'm worrying about, canals and walls and massive things. And that's, I think, where China's focus has gone to.
Yeah, how many more things do you want your phone to be able to do?
Right, exactly.
I don't know. Let me think about that.
With Aquarius, with Uranus on the West Coast, we might get teleportation. You never know. Could be the year.
Beam me up.
Yes. So, and the other thing that's going on, too, is that over Japan, and this goes down through Australia, through the heart of Japan, or Australia too, because they're on the same longitude, you have Pluto, and it's Pluto in Capricorn. Pluto in the sign of the elder. Japan is the oldest population on the planet, and it's aging faster and it's shrinking as a result.
That's incredible.
Only 15% of that, one time they were huge exporters, now only 15% of their GDP comes from exports. Most of it is jobbed out to other countries. I think there's probably more Japanese cars built in the United States than there are built in Japan now. And that's just the way that they've worked. Well, because of that, I think that they're going to, there's going to be a lot of influencing the Japanese society. Pluto is about secret power because of what the elders want, because they have such a high elderly population. But also, they see how these attacks, like these hacks done by North Korea, really affected them. Remember, Sony is essentially, even though it operates tremendously in America, a lot of money goes back to Japan. There's going to be a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. There's going to be a lot of cyber warfare this year. I think that's going on. Normally there is, but I think it's going to explode a bit this year.
I think you're right. I think we've only seen the tip of the iceberg.
Now,
it's a new way to punish people. It's a new way to leverage power.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Now, in the United States, this is interesting. We have a Saturn line, and what's interesting is in the second chart, when you look at the chart for Washington, D.C., obviously a significant spot, There is nothing in the 9th, 10th, or 11th houses, and these are the most social houses. These are the houses above in the sky above your head. There's nothing up there. There's no planets up there. I think on the Washington scene in this coming year, no one's going to want to take center stage.
Not do anything out in the open,
Right.
because that 9th, 10th, and 11th house is like under the bright midday sun. You know,
Right.
you can't really hide anything. It's all in front of everybody to see. Well, with no planets there, that means what's left, everything is in the hidden houses, the ones that are not obvious. So a lot of backdoor deals, a lot of people not wanting to step up and put their thoughts forward just in case it's going to affect them for the upcoming election in 2016. Not wanting to make overt alliances with people because they're just not sure, you know, do they go here, do they go there? So it's going to be a lot of sort of wielding your power from the closet, from the, you know, without scrutiny.
Right.
I think that everybody's going to become adept at that, but no one more than President Obama, who's
Yep.
already had to resort to using those hidden powers. I mean,
Right.
they're not hidden powers, but they're hidden in terms of what the public normal perception is
Right.
of how things get done in Washington. And so after a period of time with nothing getting done, he's resorting to these things that are making people raise their eyebrows. Oh, you can't do that. That wasn't voted on. That wasn't, you know.
But guess what?
But, you know, it's clearly there within the powers, and it's clearly here in this chart. So expect more of that.
Yep. And what's interesting is, you know, no matter where you go, you always bring a certain amount of yourself, of that place with you. Well, remember I mentioned before about the biggest concentration of planets are over Hawaii. Well, who is our most famous Hawaiian? President Obama.
There you go. Mele Kaliki Maha.
Oh, right,
said,
exactly.
Merry Christmas in Hawaiian.
During his press conference before
Yeah.
Christmas. And he's bringing a lot of power to the game here. And in the chart for Washington, we have Jupiter in Leo, very close to his sun, over the 12th house, which is basically operating the government, all the kind of stuff in the government that goes on behind the scenes. As president, he has a lot of power through the cabinet, through the State Department, through the Department of Interior, to affect things. He can give direct orders and things get carried out. Meanwhile, over here in the 6th house, you really kind of have the Congress and such. The 6th house is kind of the house before you step on the scene. It's the house
Exactly.
that relates to Virgo.
You get prepared
Yeah.
to step on the scene. You know,
Right.
you make sure that the mic is on right, and
Right.
that your colors aren't going to make this monitor go wiki, or your hair's combed.
Yeah, and you have Virgo rising. The Virgo rising is very close to President Obama's Mars. You have Gemini at the midheaven, which I believe is his moon position. So he really commands the stage. And meanwhile, over there in the 6th house, you have the whole Congress kind of saying, you know, especially among the people who want to run for president, saying, no, you go first. No, you go first. No, you go first. No one really wants to step on the stage because they don't want to misstep.
Well, and I don't think we mentioned it, but in the second new moon, so that's the one that we're using for the Chinese New Year chart, the rising is Virgo
Right.
in Washington, as opposed to the rising that we had been talking about in California was Leo.
Right.
And of course that puts that whole new moon complex and everything in Aquarius in the 6th house,
Right.
the house of workers and preparedness and, you know, planning and all that kind of thing. So there's a lot of energy there, but again, all behind the scenes because nothing is in those under the midday sun houses.
Right, and this transition, once again, I think is real interesting because it's transitioned to the 7th house. I think we're going to see a greater number of partnerships between businesses and the government. I think one thing we're going to see a lot of is an increase in covert activity. I think that this whole thing that happened with Sony recently, it was just kind of the big tip of the iceberg, you know, the Titanic tip of the iceberg. And
Is that what you're looking at?
well, yeah, the Uranus up at the 8th house.
Exactly.
And the house of power and of secrets and such. And I think you're going to see a lot of, I mean, out here on the West Coast, you're lucky if you don't have a drone looking in your window every day.
I think they do in the marina.
I could swear I saw one fly by while we were shooting this. So there's too many tech people out here, you know. So, But I think we're going to see a lot of partnerships that way. I think we're going to see a lot of covert technology going on. I think we're going to see a lot of powerful partnerships, but related to compassionate causes. Because the whole seventh house is filled with Neptune, Chiron, Venus, and Mars, all in Pisces, the sign of compassion, and planets that relate very strongly to compassion and to healing.
Yes, definitely.
So,
and again, with that Jupiter in that 12th house, sort of underscoring that whole Piscean energy.
Yeah. But I have to tell you, I think it's going to be a very good year for the country, and the reason is that 12 degrees Virgo rising, which happens to be coincidentally the degree of the founding of Google.
Which may be out there in the news and in the public a little more than they even want to be in 2015. Yeah, so we'll see how that plays out.
They could find themselves testifying there. But Washington, D.C. by its nature is a Virgo city. The whole design of the city, we call the geomancy of the city, the sacred architecture, was all designed around a major triangle of stars, a geometry that encircles the constellation of Virgo. So having Virgo at 12 degrees at the part of the rising, and that point is very important in terms of how the concept behind Washington, D.C. So I think in some ways it's going to be a very good year, and I think the fact that there isn't going to be anyone kind of hogging the stage is actually a good thing. There's actually, with that concentration of the sixth house, people actually will be getting things done, but it'll be behind the scenes, and maybe the fact that their egos aren't so tied into it, and they realize that with the president in the 12th house, this Jupiter in 12th house, he doesn't have anything to lose. He's in the fourth quarter. He's not worried about it. There's not that much they can do. They could maybe try to slow him down, but maybe they could get him to help them, because he is in a powerful position. Jupiter loves the 12th house. That I think we should actually maybe see a great deal of progress in Washington, which is funny because, hey, many games are settled in the fourth quarter. They really are.
So let's move on to some more global things that we see in the chart of the Chinese New Year forecast for 2015. Of course, we're using that second new moon in Aquarius that happens on February the 18th, where the sun and moon are at 29 degrees and 59 arc seconds of Aquarius. So it's the latest time that it could possibly be. And we've looked at the local forecast for our local area in Napa, and we've looked at the forecast for the country based on the chart for Washington, D.C. And now we're going to look at the world.
Yes. We're going to start off with London. London has Jupiter overhead, and actually the Jupiter actually runs down through Africa, and it actually goes down through the area that relates to where a lot of the Ebola epidemic is taking place. And the thing about Jupiter is that it is a planet of healing. So we will probably see, and it's in Leo, we will probably see a great deal of attention being paid to that part of the world, which is not surprising. There's already been a lot of energy going towards it, but I think it's going to be a continuing trend. For London, though, you have Jupiter up at the midheaven, and where do we have the London chart? Let's see.
It's not these.
There's London, yes. We have the midheaven up in the 11th house, which is a house of business, so it should be a very, very good business year for London. And London is one of the biggest banking centers in the world. And if you've been following the stock market and such, the money world, so to speak, the business of money has been doing very, very well. The stock market's at all-time highs in the United States. Europe is a very different system.
Look at the vertex in Taurus in the 8th house.
Exactly.
The 8th house being the planet, or the house of hidden power, but Taurus being an indicator of finances, and the vertex is just sort of that karmic point where all bets are off, anything can happen. So there's that financial insecurity is underlined in a couple of ways in Europe. Of course, their comeback from the recession was not as robust as it was here in the United States.
Right, and throughout Europe, they're still struggling. What's interesting is that the sun for them, the sun moon, is in the 5th house, which is the house of fun, of play, of creativity.
royalty,
among other things.
well, because of the
Leo
normal
connection,
Leo and
right?
the royal
Right.
star, and
The sun, with Jupiter at the midheaven in Leo, there could definitely be something going on with the royals this year. And because the sun and moon are at the transition point, one thing we're projecting, it could be that Queen Elizabeth decides that, being the longest serving monarch in history, she has set the record enough already. She's getting a little up there in years, and she doesn't want the responsibilities, and she will maybe hand over the responsibilities to her son Charles.
which was an issue that has
Yeah.
been discussed because there was the idea was put out there to skip Charles in the line of succession
Right.
and wait until that succession could turn over to William. But I think she's getting a little older, and I think the chart has some indicators that maybe she will consider that maybe Charles has grown up.
Right, and there's a lot of responsibilities that come with being queen. They're tremendously wealthy. I mean, that's part of it. And I mean, they're just tremendously wealthy people, and there's a lot to manage. And he's been managing things fairly well for most of his life. But what's interesting is that
we could look at their charts and see if that plays out as well. But we're just looking at the indicators from the Chinese New Year in London.
And what's interesting is that you have the Jupiter trining the Uranus, so it promotes an unusual decision. Take an alternative view. The classic thing was it had to be passed down to another person who had a suitable spouse. Well, where's the Uranus? In the 7th house, the area of spouse. Uranus is the alternative.
Unusual, headstrong in Aries.
Exactly.
Right.
In truth, if you go back into the history of the monarchy, they've done a lot of unusual things. It just there was no Twitter at the time. There was no Facebook. There was no paparazzi to kind of blast everything they did and examine everything. So they did a lot of unusual things.
Well, and that's what's kept her from turning this over before, because, certainly Charles would have thought that he would have succeeded the throne by now, but by having this relationship with someone who is not really the choice of the crown.
And it's been proposed for many, many years that Elizabeth II is the reincarnation of Elizabeth I, who was the other longest-serving monarch in English history. So,
Interesting.
And both were monarchs during times of great prosperity.
That's a theme. We're kind of building on a theme from previous years where partnerships are taking on sort of different roles, but they're no less important and pivotal. I have 3 planets in Libra in my natal chart, so maybe my emphasis on partnership is always very strong, but it's interesting to see it played out on the world and the national stage in terms of how important these partnerships will become.
One thing that's going on too is in China, like we mentioned in the earlier part, Saturn is over China. It's also over that part of the world, Singapore, Malaysia. I think you're going to see China continuing to really try to make this the South China Sea. At one point, this part of the world was really considered China's back door and, our front yard even. And the United States, to a certain extent, has, put more ships into that part of the world to ensure shipping. But I think we're going to see a greater willingness by China to be a little more muscular, a little more authoritative in that situation. But they are having challenges with the fact that people there, not surprisingly with the palace, right, going through there, want to be paid better. And so, companies that at one time would go to China because they were just such a great place to manufacture because labor was nothing. Well, now labor has gone 4 and 5 times up. Now suddenly they're saying, this isn't such a good deal. Know who the biggest growth is actually Mexico.
For labor.
For manufacturers in the United States. The labor is still pretty reasonable. It's not as reasonable quite as China, but the shipping's a lot less.
It's true.
When you have to ship it 5 to 10,000 miles, it gets a little more expensive. And most cargo travels by ship.
Well, and that, as you talked about in the previous segment, we were talking about the increasing the ability to ship through, the Panama Canal and the new canal that's proposed close to it. So, it really increasingly makes that the world smaller, and our ability to share resources and benefit each other has just hugely increased.
You know what's real interesting is in the charts, this section in the Middle East, from Tripoli all the way over through Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Afghanistan, all the way through India. India is the closest thing to the Saturn, but especially from Tehran to almost to Tripoli, how there's no planets overhead.
Right.
It's kind of interesting. All through the years of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, there were major planets in that area every year during the Chinese New Year, and they were troublemakers. It was Mars, it was Uranus, it was Saturn, there were crossings, there was all kind. I mean, it was just,
and there aren't even any planets overhead on the continental United States.
Right, exactly.
So it's a year where these, things that have, places that have really taken the forefront in years past in terms of, the global, microscope, really get a chance to step back and let other parts of the world come to the forefront in terms of activity and concern.
And in fact, last year I think there was only one major planet overhead, and the United States has been to a certain extent in a reactive mode. The United States is such a large economy, and we really don't even export very much anymore. I mean, something like 17%, 17% of our GDP comes from exports. That we're able to be almost a self-contained economy, including California, Canada, and Mexico.
North America.
North America. So, but also even South America has very few planets over it too. So we're really in when you get these kind of patterns, you get a year in which you get to coast a little bit. You tend to not feel like anyone is pushing you in any particular direction. One thing that is going on that's interesting is that there is a powerful IC line, and it's Saturn, and it goes right up through Detroit. It goes up through Atlanta and up through Detroit. Well, Detroit is America's biggest problem child in terms of cities. And it may be that with Saturn and Sag, but they're finally going to start saying, look, we got problems, but how are we going to build for the future?
Well, and Saturn talks about infrastructure or plans for how to make a living. Detroit has lived on the auto industry for a very long time, so maybe they retool, maybe they bring in other kinds of industry there to try to rebuild that, get back to their roots, so to speak, because that IC line talks about, where you're grounded on the earth, where where your beginnings are. And so with Saturn there, it's kind of like dad tapping his toe saying, okay, what are you going to do when you grow up?
Higher education.
Yeah.
Plan for the future.
That may well also be an component, finding different ways to educate people on a more sort of physical, hands-on, technical basis to retool the people for the industries that come to replace the ones that have gone by the wayside in that area.
And what's interesting is that during President Obama's press conference right before Christmas, he said that just very recently, just in the last probably week or so, the auto industry, who had been bailed out, had paid back the last of the money they had been loaned, plus all of the interest. Right. So they were finally out of hock. Well, maybe at this point, they have treated, that's been their hometown forever, the big auto industries. Well, maybe it's time that the auto industries start investing in the infrastructure. They've certainly made enough money there over the years.
Exactly.
In many countries, for many years, the single biggest money generator in a country has been the auto industries. Tremendous producers.
That'll be interesting to watch Detroit.
Yeah. One thing I mentioned, kind of touched on lately, was with all these planets around Hawaii, I think it may be tumultuous there this year. I think there could be a lot of
landmass changes due to volcanic activity, which of course is related to the earthquake activity that we're feeling here in this area as well.
Yeah, and I think that we may see a lot of weather events as well. I think we're going to see some fairly significant weather events in the Pacific, close up to the United States, with that Uranus there as well. And I think we're going to continue to see quite a few tremblers going on. But may you live in interesting times kind of situation.
Yeah, there's quite a number of us that have bookmarked the USGS website and have a little earthquake notifier app on our phone. And told me this morning there was a couple of earthquakes in Nevada, about 3.1, 3.2.
Yeah.
So you want to know these things in as much advance as you possibly can.
Right, exactly. And what's kind of interesting is, like I said, even over Russia and such, the only thing that you have running up through Russia is, you have Mars. I guess that's Mars icy lines running through there, coming up through Russia. And then you have, a Uranus icy line running through there. So they're going to continue to have disruption, with the dropping of the price of oil. Oil's one of their single biggest sources of money in Russia.
And these icy lines, they're not planets overhead, but they're more subtle energy over time. It's just, what are they going to work on? What do they need to address from a base level kind of point of view?
Well, what it means is that that the planet is passing on the other side of the Earth from you, so it's below your feet. And of course, when the planet Uranus was first discovered, Herschel, who was the discoverer of it, was trying to figure out its astrological significance. I believe that he was the one who wrote this, and he said when Uranus passed over his fourth house cusp, his IC, which is that line, his house burned down.
Oh.
So he decided, it means like sudden changes. Well, you have the IC lines running up underneath that part of the world. Let's see. But it also runs up through Russia.
Oh, wait a minute, that's Putin's house. No, just
right.
kidding.
But it also runs up, interesting, it also runs up under Saudi Arabia and through Iran. I'm sorry, I've been saying that area is relatively quiet.
Well, you were saying it was quiet because there's no planets overhead. But
and then you have Mars and Venus run up through Warsaw and that part of the world. So it looks like that part of the world will have a lot of turmoil, but it will be felt at home. It won't be felt, out there in the world.
It's not being projected. Good word.
But they'll feel at home.
Exactly. So, I think of it more like internal changes, internal, redefinition, internal kind of, so it's not like the change is no longer ballistic. It's practical based, because the IC is very practical based. So I think that they'll continue to act and react to what has gone on before and make some changes in the way that they operate.
I think that Iran, Saudi Arabia, and up into Russia, I think those areas are going to be boiling with that Uranus there, because it's Uranus in Aries. It's a hot position.
A slow simmer.
Well,
kind of
I think
thing.
it's going to be. I think you're going to find that it may be that Putin, just proves too unpopular. Uranus is the change. Aries is. Aries is the personality. There could be a change in leadership. It's going up through Saudi Arabia.
Not just a flip flop.
Yeah. Like right now, there's been a real movement in Saudi Arabia among women. The women moving forward.
That's true.
There was
That's
like
true.
The day
And
when
again, behind the scenes,
at
basic home.
Yeah, home.
That's what the IC is all about.
Yeah, maybe Putin's wife won't love him anymore. Hey.
Is he married?
He's got to be married. To be president, any place on the planet don't have to be married.
I don't think so.
Luckily, Hillary has Bill, otherwise she would be able to be president.
I think so. I don't know.
So that's some of the other observations. Interesting stuff going on this year.
So if you're not on our email blast list to get the forecast delivered to your email box, just contact us and let us know. I'm happy to add you to our list. We send it out once a year on the Chinese New Year. Maybe we should do it twice. Maybe we should do the first one and the second one.
Maybe. And of course, if you can get the planetary calendar and follow along for the entire year. We're the authors of that as well. And follow our TV show, The Planetary Calendar, which Lahni is on with our lovely publisher, Karen
Right.
And of course, Ask Ralph Lahni, which is Ask Ralph Lahni. So,
And of course, you can always send us a question because we answer what you ask.
Exactly. That's what the show's based upon. What do people ask?
So, hope you enjoyed this little extended episode, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah. Happy New Year.